Hey guys, tonight we're going to settle in for something a little different. So dim the lights, fluff up your pillow just right, maybe grab a lukewarm cup of whatever keeps you awake, or helps you pretend you're awake. Tonight we're floating over to the medieval countryside, which, let me tell you, was less life in a Renaissance painting and more chilly, muddy, slightly smelly, but somehow necessary. We'll be talking about how the people who weren't wearing crowns or commissioning massive tapestries of themselves actually survived the long, cold nights. And yes, there will be the occasional glance at the elites, because why not compare your frozen toes to someone else's royal slippers? Imagine, if you will, a peasant cottage in the heart of Europe, sometime around the 14th century. Small, dark, probably smelled faintly of smoked meat and livestock, with maybe a hint of damp straw. The walls were often made of wattle and daub, which is basically sticks and mud plastered together, so insulation was minimal at best. If you were imagining anything cozy, I'm sorry, but medieval cozy was really just the lesser of multiple freezing options. Fires were lit for cooking and warmth, but ventilation wasn't exactly top of mind, so you could roast your hands while simultaneously inhaling smoke like it was part of the diet. Now, sleeping arrangements were, shall we say, communal. Families often shared one room, and beds were sometimes shared, which means a fair amount of incidental body heat. If you think modern-day bed sharing is awkward, just picture an entire household of 5 or 6 people, maybe a couple of farm animals, and the occasional stray chicken. Yes, some chickens. They weren't pets, they were practical, though that doesn't stop them from flapping around at 2 in the morning. And the bedding? Straw mattresses, sometimes a bit of linen if you were lucky. Wash cycles were basically non-existent, so the aroma of medieval hygiene was a consistent olfactory companion. Food, or the lack thereof, played a huge role in surviving the cold. The staple diet was mostly grains, usually in the form of bread or pottage, which is a kind of watery stew that makes modern soup look luxurious. There were occasional vegetables, root crops mainly because, let's face it, medieval peasants didn't have greenhouses, and you can only rely on cabbage and turnips so long before it starts to feel repetitive. Meat was rarer, reserved for holidays, or if you were very lucky, or very unlucky depending on how you look at it, enough to butcher a pig. And let's not forget the ale, because water was often unsafe. Ale was essentially a daily beverage. Think of it as slightly alcoholic, thick liquid bread that warmed you from the inside, which probably helped with the whole freezing winter nights thing. Now, one might assume that life was relentlessly grim, and while it certainly had its share of hardships, it also had a kind of rhythmic monotony that, in a weird way, was comforting. Days were long, yes, filled with labor, plowing, sowing, harvesting, repairing fences, thatching roofs, tending to animals, but the work gave structure, and structure is surprisingly relaxing when you think about it. Unlike a royal, whose day might involve worrying about conspiracies, poisoning, or whether their latest joust had ruined their hair, peasants mostly worried about whether the cow had been milked or if the rain would finally stop soaking the fields. And speaking of cows, let's pause there for a second. Animals were central to survival. Cows, goats, pigs, and chickens weren't pets, they were life support systems. The cow gave milk, the goat did a similar job, the pig provided meat if you could catch it before winter killed it, and the chickens gave eggs, though they were often slightly worse for wear after living in the same mud-soaked yard. You also had dogs, usually mutts, which could be helpful for herding or protection, but mostly they just looked cute and occasionally scared away foxes. And foxes, as it turns out, were excellent at causing minor panic. Medieval winters were brutal, of course. There were cold snaps that lasted weeks, and without modern heating, even the stoutest peasant could shiver through the night. Clothing was layered, wool being the mainstay because linen was less insulating and more ceremonial in nature. Wealthier peasants might have a second layer or slightly thicker shoes, but most wore wooden clogs or basic leather boots. Everyone looked basically the same, and the fashion wars of the 14th century were not happening in the fields of rural Europe. As we float over to another aspect of peasant life, consider the social structure. There were lords, of course, who owned the land, and peasants worked it. Some were serfs, which basically meant you belonged to the land forever, but with limited rights, while others had slightly more freedom, owning small plots. Either way, hierarchy was always present. The peasants knew the lords were having slightly warmer nights, slightly better food, slightly fancier bedding, and yet there was a certain rhythm to being a peasant. Wake up with the sunrise, work until exhaustion, eat, sleep, repeat. Monotony was the ultimate comfort, at least until the winter storms hit. But let's not pretend that peasants were without their small joys. Festivals happened, though less frequently than one might hope. Weddings, harvest celebrations, and religious feasts punctuated the otherwise repetitive calendar. Music was involved sometimes, flutes, drums, maybe someone could carry a tune, though drunken, ale-fueled singing was more common than polished performance. Dancing was usually a necessity to warm up frozen limbs, and storytelling around the fire provided entertainment that could be surprisingly dramatic, despite the lack of Netflix or YouTube. One curious detail about medieval nighttime is that it was long, really long. Without electric lights, people went to bed early and woke up early. Candles existed, but they were expensive, so most households relied on the fading daylight. This meant evenings were quiet, almost meditative. Families huddled together, and if the wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, it became part of the ambient soundtrack. The darkness was absolute, and the imagination could wander, which probably led to stories of ghosts, witches, and mischievous spirits. But let's be honest, those stories were also slightly comforting. They gave a narrative to the cold and the darkness. Of course, the life of peasants had its darker side, even if we're keeping things sleep-inducing tonight. Illness was a constant companion, nutrition was limited, and survival was never guaranteed. Small injuries could fester, winters could starve, and epidemics could sweep through villages, leaving behind quiet, almost invisible devastation. But the people adapted. They relied on herbal remedies, communal support, and sheer stubbornness. And in a way, the harshness of life created a resilience that's easy to overlook when thinking about history. Now, let's float over to the contrast with the elites, because what's a history lesson without a touch of irony? While peasants were huddling in mud walls, kings and queens were fussing over tapestries, elaborate gowns, and whether the feast's swans were fresh enough. Royal heating solutions were slightly more sophisticated, fireplaces with stone surrounds, large drafty halls that were slightly less drafty than a peasant cottage. Food was abundant, if sometimes oddly flavored, and the beds, while luxurious by comparison, were shared with chambers full of attendants who did everything from fluffing pillows to fanning the monarch for comfort. Yet, for all their wealth, royals weren't immune to the cold, at least psychologically. Many of them suffered from paranoia, depression, and anxiety that modern historians speculate could have been related to their indoor lifestyles and constant pressure to reproduce. In a slightly ironic twist, the peasants might have been more at peace with their nights than the lords. They understood the rhythm of the day, the cycle of seasons, and the limits of their control, while the nobles often fretted over appearances, alliances, and obscure rituals that, from the outside, seem both excessive and mildly sad.
And speaking of rituals, bedtime for peasants was simple. You ate, you tucked yourself into your straw bed, you huddled for warmth, and you drifted off to the ambient symphony of cows, chickens, wind, and maybe an occasional argument over whose turn it was to fetch water in the freezing morning. Contrast that with a royal bedtime ritual that might include prayers, attendants suggesting covers, and whispered gossip about who was plotting against whom in the court. One is monotonous, the other slightly more stressful, yet both involve lying down and hoping not to shiver or overheat in the case of some overdressed nobles. As we drift through these quiet hours, consider also that medieval life was incredibly tactile. People felt the texture of their clothing, the unevenness of their floors, the chill of stone walls, and the warmth of fires and animals. Life was physically grounded, which is part of why the daily rhythm, as harsh as it was, could be comforting. There was an order, even in hardship. The cold was a constant companion, but so was routine. And routine, as you may have noticed,
can be surprisingly hypnotic when told in a soft, even tone. And so, as the night stretches on in our imagination, we can picture a peasant household, fire crackling, animals nestled close, the wind howling outside, and the family slowly drifting into sleep. Perhaps the eldest child dreams of warmer days, or the youngest clings to a sibling for heat. Outside, the snow, or mud depending on the region, reflects faint moonlight. The world is silent, save for the occasional animal noise or distant creak of a roof. And in that silence, life goes on, quietly persistent, stubbornly simple, and strangely serene. Even when the cold bites and the world seems vast and unyielding, people find ways to adapt. They build, they layer, they cook, they huddle. And while their lives were full of challenges that we can hardly imagine today, there was a rhythm, a continuity, and a strange, quiet dignity in surviving, night after night, year after year. So, as we linger here for a moment in the calm of medieval nighttime, surrounded by the low hum of domestic life and the soft sighs of wind through straw roofs, we can take a gentle lesson. Survival is sometimes just a matter of enduring, of finding warmth where you can, of noticing the little structures that make life bearable. And in that quiet endurance, even the coldest, darkest nights have a certain peacefulness, if you let them.
Let's ease back into the rhythm of the night. Imagine the snow beginning to fall, not in dramatic Hollywood flurries, but as a steady, quiet drizzle that settles over the village, muffling sound and turning everything pale. Roads disappear under white layers, and the cold creeps into every corner. Peasants, by now, are accustomed to this because winters were long and utterly predictable in their relentlessness. You either learned to deal with it or you suffered. Survival was not glamorous, and yet the ingenuity of human beings shines even in the mud and frost. One of the first things peasants had to contend with was frostbite. Imagine that. Fingers turning numb and blue while you try to milk a cow or fetch water from a frozen stream. Gloves existed, but they were usually thick, coarse, and occasionally knitted by someone who didn't particularly care if your thumbs got frostbitten. There were also the more unconventional solutions. Animal fat, for instance, was smeared on extremities to keep the chill at bay. It's greasy, it smells faintly like a barn, and it works, which is really the medieval motto. It's ugly, it's smelly, but it gets the job done. Cold nights were also a time for storytelling, which, in addition to passing the hours, functioned as a kind of psychological insulation. Tales of local spirits, mischievous fairies, and haunted wells served the dual purpose of entertainment and mild behavioral guidance. Don't wander off into the woods at night, or you might be carried away by a spirit. Or, in reality, you'd probably just get lost and frostbitten, which is much less fun. There was also a subtle humor in these stories, though of course the peasants were not exactly chuckling uproariously. A little nervous smile maybe, a sigh, and back to the straw bed. Food scarcity was a constant concern in the winter, so peasants developed clever ways to stretch what they had. Porridge, as unappetizing as it sounds to modern ears, could be flavored with herbs, honey, or sometimes the occasional dried fruit. Roots stored in cellars lasted surprisingly well, provided you didn't forget to check them for mold, which was apparently a common winter pastime, peeling away layers of rot to reach the edible core. And ale, of course, remained a staple, slightly alcoholic and almost medicinal, warming from the inside. Now let's consider hygiene, or the medieval approximation thereof. Baths were rare, largely because water had to be hauled and heated manually, which is labor-intensive, especially in freezing weather. People relied on rubbing themselves with cloths, herbs, and sometimes even vinegar to stay reasonably clean. Hair washing was even less common, often reserved for the occasional festive day or a visit from someone whose judgment mattered, like a local priest.
Smells were accepted as part of life, and this acceptance made for a rather unself-conscious society. Modern notions of hygiene-induced shame were largely absent, which in a quiet, calming way is kind of soothing to imagine. Let's drift for a moment to another survival tool, fire. Every household had a hearth, central to cooking, heating, and sometimes socializing. Fires had to be carefully tended. Too much smoke and you suffocate, too little and you freeze. Ashes were often saved because they could be spread on icy paths to prevent slips or even mixed into the soil for the garden. Nothing went to waste because survival was about efficiency, not aesthetics. The smell of smoke mingling with straw, cooking food, and animal odors created a distinctive atmosphere, something close to a medieval perfume but stronger. One fascinating thing about peasant ingenuity is how much it relied on observation. They knew which roots grew best in certain soils, which herbs alleviated fevers, and which rituals might, according to tradition, keep livestock healthy through a harsh winter. Some remedies sound bizarre to modern ears, hanging garlic in doorways to ward off illness, sprinkling water from a sacred spring over the livestock, or whispering protective prayers while tending the fire. These actions were part medicine, part superstition, and entirely normal. They added structure to the winter night, a rhythm that was comforting and gently hypnotic.
Animals, again, deserve their own meditation. Winter was especially hard for them. Cows and goats had to be fed stored hay, and pigs, who usually roamed a little more freely, were confined to prevent freezing and wandering. Chickens, if they survived the cold, were kept indoors in simple pens. The warmth of these animals often became crucial for survival. People would sleep near cows or goats for added heat, which must have been mildly awkward but effective. A cat curled at the foot of the bed was luxury. A dog lying across your feet, practical. The line between practicality and comfort blurred in fascinating ways. Now, let's drift back to the occasional royal contrast, because it's mildly amusing. While peasants were huddling with animals and smearing themselves with fat, royals were indoors with tapestries, heated floors, in rare cases, and chambers so elaborate they probably had lost track of where the draft came from. They worried about appearances, political machinations, and sometimes whether their servants were plotting rebellion over improperly folded bed linens. Peasants, in contrast, had a simpler set of concerns, which were more immediate: warmth, food, sleep. And perhaps in the monotony of those worries, there was a certain calm, an almost hypnotic certainty that the world was orderly if you simply followed the rhythm. Winter also brought communal activities. People helped each other with tasks that were too difficult alone, chopping firewood, repairing roofs, or bringing in the last of the harvest before frost claimed it. This fostered a quiet social cohesion. Villagers weren't constantly chatting or gossiping, at least not in a way we'd find lively. They were working, helping, enduring. Even disputes, when they arose, were often about practical matters: whose cow wandered into whose field, or whether the storage cellar was being fairly divided. And if there was a minor argument, it was over before bedtime, because sleep, after all, was a high priority when the temperature hovered uncomfortably low. One curious thing is that peasants often had surprisingly rich, imaginative lives. Nights were long, and without screens or books for most, imagination filled the gaps. Folk songs, lullabies, and stories passed orally from generation to generation painted a landscape of local history, heroes, disasters, and miracles. These weren't always strictly true, but they were useful. They gave shape to the night, turned fear into narrative, and offered small pleasures in the otherwise relentless cold. And let's not ignore the occasional medieval luxury: spices. They were rare, expensive, and sometimes smuggled into villages by traveling merchants. A pinch of cinnamon or cloves could transform a humble porridge into something resembling indulgence. For peasants,
Even a minor luxury like this could brighten the bleakest winter evening. Contrast this with a royal who, despite having spices in abundance, might still complain that the saffron in their stew wasn't perfectly ground. Perspective, it seems, is relative. Survival was also about timing, knowing when to plant, when to harvest, when to butcher, and when to prepare for the long nights was an art. Mistiming could mean hunger, illness, or worse. The rhythms of the seasons dominated life, creating a gentle but inescapable structure. Even when snow fell and the wind howled, the peasant understood the cycle. Spring follows winter, and even frost cannot last forever. We should also acknowledge the psychological strategies peasants developed. Humor, even dry and subdued, was a coping mechanism. Mild complaints, gentle teasing, and ironic observations about lords and priests provided a form of relief. "At least I'm not melting in velvet," a peasant might think as he scraped frost from his boots. These small mental tricks helped manage the relentless grind of winter and gave nights a subtle warmth that fire alone could not provide. And as the night stretches, we drift to one final detail: the preparation for sleep itself. By late evening, the cottage is quiet. Fires burn low, animals settle, and the family arranges themselves on straw beds. Children are tucked close to parents, blankets layered, and sometimes an elder murmurs a prayer or a blessing, less from fear and more as a gentle punctuation to the day. The cold remains outside, but inside there is a slow, almost meditative comfort. Sleep, when it comes, is deep and rhythmic. Even the faint creaks of the cottage are reassuring. The house is alive, the family is safe, and the cycle continues. So, as we linger here in this quiet corner of history, it's worth noting that survival wasn't glamorous and life wasn't easy, but there was a certain hypnotic order to it. Work, warmth, food, sleep, storytelling, care for animals, and communal cooperation created a rhythm that carried people through the coldest nights. And in imagining it, we might find a strange, gentle peace ourselves. All right, let's ease back into the rhythm of the night. Picture again that small, smoky cottage, straw mattresses in place, fire glowing low, and the cold pressing gently against the walls. The night is long, the wind is steady, and the faint sounds of animals breathing and shifting in their pens form a subtle background hum. In these quiet hours, one concern always lingered in the peasant mind: illness. Disease in medieval Europe was, of course, relentless. Not quite the world-ending catastrophes of some plague stories, though those existed, but daily nuisances and sometimes more serious threats. Fevers, colds, infections, and stomach ailments were constant companions. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, so peasants relied on observation, trial and error, and tradition. Herbs were the cornerstone of treatment: chamomile for calming the stomach, willow bark as a crude painkiller, garlic to ward off evil and sometimes illness. The line between superstition and practical medicine was blurry, which is perhaps reassuring in its gentle logic. Let's float over to some of the more curious remedies, which were often as much about ritual as efficacy. A feverish child might have a raw onion tied around their neck because the belief was that it would draw out sickness. Adults might drink a concoction of herbs and honey, muttering prayers or charms under their breath. If livestock fell ill, a mix of ritual, herbs, and mild panic usually ensued. These methods might seem quaint or ineffective to us, but they served a purpose: structure. In a world largely governed by the seasons and the whims of nature, having a procedure to follow, however strange, brought comfort and a sense of control. Witchcraft and superstition also played a subtle role. Peasants were careful not to cross certain lines, stepping on cracks, breaking a mirror, or ignoring a strange sign in the sky could mean misfortune. There were local wise women, often called healers or cunning folk, who combined herbal knowledge with charm work. Visiting them was not just about healing, it was a ritual, a gentle narrative that helped people frame illness and danger in a way that made sense. Even the occasional minor curse was more of a social tool than a real threat, a way to explain what was otherwise inexplicable. And yet, while superstition shaped treatment, the daily realities of illness were simple. If someone had a fever, they were often confined to bed, warmed as best as possible, and fed light foods like porridge or broth. Family members hovered nearby, adjusting blankets, fanning away flies, offering sips of ale for warmth. Comfort more than cure was the priority. And in the quiet attentiveness of these nights, there was a strange intimacy. The small gestures of care, repeated day after day, created bonds that were as essential as food or fire. Animals, too, fell ill occasionally. A sick cow or goat meant not just a worry for the individual creature, but a concern for the family's survival. Remedies might involve herbal poultices, tying charms to the animal, or chanting softly while feeding them. The strategies were rarely perfect, but consistency mattered more than perfection. Even failure had a rhythm, a gentle lesson in observation, patience, and endurance. It's worth noting that some of the more dramatic epidemics, though not constant, cast long shadows over villages. Outbreaks of smallpox, dysentery, or influenza were frightening, yet the day-to-day survival strategies remained largely unchanged. People continued their work, tended their animals, and followed seasonal cycles. Fear existed, yes, but it was woven into the fabric of life, like the cold that pressed against the walls at night. Life didn't pause for illness, it adjusted. Let's drift over to the oddities of medieval hygiene again. In winter, bathing was difficult, and so peasants often relied on rubbing herbs on the skin to cleanse themselves. Common herbs included rosemary, sage, and lavender. The smells were strong, sometimes masking less pleasant odors from cooking, animals, or close quarters. Hair washing was rare, and lice were considered inevitable, tolerated rather than fought with vigor. In this context, the occasional visit from a traveling barber-surgeon or a local healer brought not just medical attention, but novelty. A shave, a poultice, or even just a discussion of remedies was a break from the monotony of the winter routine. Food, again, played a subtle role in health. Root vegetables, grains, and preserved foods provided the baseline, while occasional fruits or spices offered minor indulgences. Ale was not just warming, it was slightly antiseptic, which may have prevented some illness in a world with unsafe water. Everyone drank it with a sense of quiet practicality. It kept you alive, and it helped the hours pass. And of course, we can't ignore mental resilience. Medieval peasants were experts in small joys and subtle distractions. Knitting, mending, storytelling, and casual songs provided relief from monotony and cold. Even minor teasing among family members, gentle ribbing, or mild complaints about the cold functioned as coping mechanisms. Humor, in its understated form, was a tool for psychological survival, a tiny fire in the heart as the real fire glowed in the hearth. Let's gently contrast with the elites again, because it's always comforting to have perspective. Kings and queens had doctors, apothecaries, and armies of attendants, yet they often fared no better than peasants in the face of disease. Their remedies were sometimes more elaborate: spices, imported herbs, and bizarre treatments like powdered mummy or crushed gemstones, but the results were often no more effective. Sometimes wealth merely amplified the stress. The more people fussed over the sick royal, the more anxiety rippled through the palace. Peasants, in contrast, had simpler strategies, and sometimes that simplicity brought a kind of quiet efficiency, even if the odds were not great. Sleep, as always, remained the great healer. By evening, after tending animals, finishing chores, and preparing what little food they had, peasants settled into their straw beds. Warmth came from shared body heat, proximity to animals, and the lingering fire. Children curled close to parents, elders murmured prayers, and the house exhaled a soft collective sigh. The rhythm of night was unbroken: warmth, vigilance, minimal comfort, rest. And while disease and cold lingered, they were part of the cycle, predictable and manageable in the small, repetitive ways that mattered. Winter nights also shaped creativity in small ways. Songs and stories were longer, repeated, and passed down with slight variations. Folk remedies became narratives, full of characters, explanations, and rituals. The imagination flourished in these long, quiet hours, even if its output was subtle. A story whispered to a child, a song hummed while scraping frost from boots, a memory of last summer's harvest, gently recalled in the dim light.
And as we drift toward the end of our Part 3 nightscape, it's worth reflecting that survival was less about heroics and more about rhythm. Daily work, seasonal routines, care for family and animals, adherence to ritual, and gentle observation of nature all combined into a steady flow. Hardships existed, yet they were structured, predictable, and thus quietly bearable. The small victories, keeping a child warm, saving a root crop, fending off illness with a poultice, were enough to carry people through the long nights. Even superstition, odd remedies, and ritualized care had a subtle beauty. They gave context, comfort, and narrative to life. The onion around the neck, the charm over the fire, the whispered prayers, and the shared laughter, these were all part of a tapestry of survival, stitched quietly in straw-filled cottages across Europe. In this gentle, slow way, life persisted, night after night, winter after winter, in a rhythm that is oddly comforting to imagine today. And so, as we let our minds linger on the faint glow of a dying fire, the scent of herbs and smoke, the soft breathing of animals, and the muffled sounds of winter outside, we realize that medieval peasants, for all their hardships, had a kind of calm mastery over their environment. The cold was constant, disease lurked, and superstition shaped behavior, but routine, resilience, and subtle pleasures carried them through. And in imagining it, we too might find a slow, quiet peace.
Let's settle back into the quiet of a medieval winter night. The fire is low, smoke curling lazily toward the low ceiling, and outside, the wind hums against the walls. Imagine the cottage once more. Straw beds arranged carefully, animals tucked close for warmth, and the faint aroma of yesterday's porridge lingering in the air. Life is monotonous, yes, but it has rhythm. And tonight, we'll meander through the ways peasants made that rhythm meaningful, through food, festivals, and small absurdities that made survival slightly more bearable. Food scarcity in winter was the ever-present background hum. By the time December and January rolled around, stores from the last harvest were stretched thin. Porridge, roots, and preserved vegetables formed the baseline of the diet. Occasionally, a family might have stored dried fruits or a little honey, which were considered luxuries. Eating was functional, rhythmic, and not particularly glamorous. Still, even modest food could feel celebratory if eaten slowly, shared carefully, and warmed by firelight. The slow rhythm of eating, repeated day after day, was itself comforting, a gentle ritual of survival. Let's float for a moment over the rare occasions of indulgence. Winter festivals and religious holidays were the highlight of the year. These events, although not extravagant by royal standards, were intensely meaningful. Villagers might gather for church celebrations, feast on preserved meats, or share a modest cake spiced with whatever rare imports had made their way into local markets. Ale flowed, and storytelling became slightly more dramatic, with heroic exaggerations creeping in as the night wore on. Children and adults alike would hum, sing, or recite folk tales, their voices echoing softly in the cold, still air. Even minor dances, clumsy, practical, sometimes hilarious, served a practical purpose, warming the body. Hunger, though, was a subtle companion, even during festivals. Every meal was a careful balance between necessity and indulgence. If the larder ran low, the household rationed cleverly. Porridge in the morning, vegetables at noon, small quantities of bread in the evening. Root vegetables were stored in cellars, sometimes layered in sand to preserve freshness. Herbs were added for flavor, yes, but also for warmth, aroma, and subtle medicinal effects. Even the simplest meal became a minor exercise in creativity, patience, and endurance. Animals once again played their quiet role. Winter was hard for livestock, and their care dominated much of peasant attention. Chickens were kept warm and fed small amounts of grain. Goats were sheltered, and cows received carefully rationed hay. Every animal saved for warmth, food, or labor was precious. The rhythm of tending animals was a constant hum in the household, soothing in its predictability. Even the occasional chaos, chickens escaping, pigs rooting in the snow, added tiny humorous interruptions that reminded villagers that life had its absurdities. And speaking of absurdities, peasants developed clever and sometimes ridiculous practices to cope with the cold and monotony. One curious method for preserving food involved hanging vegetables or small meats near the fire, not too close to cook, just close enough to dry slowly. Another involved placing ale in straw-lined containers to keep it from freezing overnight. Some households carried out superstitious rituals, like whispering over food to bless it, or tying small charms around livestock. These actions were half practical, half magical, and entirely normal. They created a rhythm that comforted the mind, if not always the stomach. Winter festivals, while modest, were highlights in this otherwise repetitive cycle. Candlelight illuminated small gatherings, families shared stories and songs, and children ran around in bundled layers, their laughter muted by scarves and the cold. The hum of simple music, flutes, drums, or even improvised percussion filled the room. Even when the feast was simple, the joy was real, a quiet celebration of survival. These events punctuated the long nights with rhythm, continuity, and small doses of human delight. Let's float over to social dynamics. Life in the village, while cooperative, was also full of minor absurdities. Disputes over land boundaries, wandering animals, or the occasional misplaced tool were commonplace. But these disputes were rarely violent. They were usually settled with gentle negotiation, community consensus, or mild sarcasm. Humor played a subtle role in smoothing social friction. A teasing comment about a neighbor's frozen boots or the size of their onion harvest was enough to defuse tension and bring a smile, softening the monotony of winter days. The daily rhythm also extended to nighttime routines. By late evening, households arranged themselves for sleep. Straw beds were shared, blankets layered, and animals tucked close. Elders often murmured prayers, not from fear, but as a gentle punctuation of the day. Children curled close, bodies pressed together for warmth, and the fire provided a low, steady glow. The world outside was silent, cold, and vast, but inside, life continued in a gentle, predictable cadence. Even minor indulgences had their significance. Spices, rare preserved fruits, or a slightly richer ale were celebrated quietly, with appreciation rather than extravagance. They punctuated the otherwise rhythmic cycle of survival with moments of quiet delight. Peasants understood the value of small pleasures, a warm hand, a shared story, a clean bit of straw, or the soft purring of a cat curled by the fire. These moments were quietly luxurious compared to the hardships of life, and they carried a profound, subtle joy.
And of course, there were the absurdities of domestic life. Chickens flapping in the firelight, a pig wandering too close to the hearth, or a child waking in the middle of the night to cry because of cold feet. These minor interruptions were part of the texture of life. They were not exciting in a dramatic sense, but they were vivid in their familiarity, a gentle reminder that life was lived in small moments, repeated over time. Contrasting with the elites once more, the subtle beauty of peasant life becomes clearer. Nobles had grand feasts, elaborate dances, and carefully orchestrated rituals, yet they were constantly worried about appearances, alliances, and maintaining control. Peasants, in contrast, were focused on immediate, tactile concerns: warmth, food, social harmony, and minor indulgences. The simplicity of their concerns, though harsh, carried a kind of hypnotic order. Even adversity had rhythm, and rhythm is comforting. So as we linger for a moment on this slow winter night, picture the cottage once more. The fire burns low, animals breathe quietly, and the family settles for sleep. Stories echo softly, laughter ripples faintly, and the occasional small disaster, frozen porridge, spilled ale, a wandering chicken, is absorbed into the fabric of life. Outside, the snow drifts, silent and unrelenting. Inside, life persists, warm in its small, repeated gestures. And as we drift to the very edges of this night, we notice that survival was more than endurance. It was observation, creativity, cooperation, and subtle humor. Winter was cold, food scarce, and disease constant, but these challenges were met with rhythm, ingenuity, and small pleasures. Even in a world without modern comforts, medieval peasants found ways to endure, adapt, and occasionally to celebrate the quiet victories of daily life. In imagining this, we can allow ourselves to drift gently. The smell of smoke, the touch of straw, the warmth of an animal, and the subtle rhythm of night are all part of a long, flowing pattern. It is a pattern that carries human beings through cold, dark nights, and perhaps, even today, it can help us find a quiet, soothing calm. All right, let's imagine the world starting to change. After months of cold, dark nights, snow-covered fields, and frozen streams, spring begins its slow, almost imperceptible creep. The sun lingers a little longer in the sky, ice melts in patches, and the wind loses some of its bite. For medieval peasants, this was subtle yet profound. It meant work would change, routines would shift, and for a brief moment, there was hope that warmth might actually stay. Spring wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive like a parade with trumpets. It was quiet, a patch of green in the field, the thawing of a frozen pond, or the first brave daffodil pushing through hardened earth signaled that winter had passed. Peasants noticed these signs with a mixture of relief and mild anxiety. Winter had been hard, yes, but spring brought new work, new challenges, and sometimes, just occasionally, a little joy. The first task of spring was often the repair and preparation of tools and dwellings. Thatched roofs that sagged under winter snow had to be mended, fences rebuilt, and walls patched. Tools dulled and sometimes broken by hard frost were sharpened and repaired. Every action was slow, deliberate, and necessary. And because work was essential for survival, there was a rhythm to it, a calm repetition that grounded the days. Even the most tedious chores, cleaning out barns, mending nets, or sharpening hoes, became part of a meditative flow. Animals emerged from winter in various states. Goats, cows, pigs, and chickens had survived in close quarters, warmed by straw and each other. Now, as fields thawed, they could stretch their legs, graze on fresh grass, and begin their subtle dance of seasonal reproduction. Peasants watched carefully because the health and productivity of livestock determined the rhythm of life. A cow in good health meant milk for the table,
while a stubborn goat could inspire a low, bemused sigh and gentle coaxing. The subtleties of social interaction, sarcasm, irony, small jokes, helped smooth the rhythm of village life, creating quiet resilience. The passage of seasons, in fact, dominated peasant consciousness. Winter brought stillness, hardship, and routine. Spring offered subtle renewal, work, and hope. Summer promised abundance, long days, and slightly more freedom to enjoy life. Autumn returned them to preparation, storage, and anticipation of winter's harsh return. Each season had its rhythm, its challenges, and its minor pleasures. The flow of time became a kind of slow, hypnotic meditation, one that structured life, work, and thought.
Even leisure had its rhythm. Between chores, peasants might spin wool, mend clothing, or repair household tools. They sang while working, not for performance, but to maintain morale and a gentle sense of continuity. Small games, storytelling, and improvisational music punctuated workdays. These acts were understated, often amusing in subtle ways, and provided relief from monotony. Even minor absurdities, spilled ale, tangled wool, or muddy shoes, were absorbed into the ongoing rhythm of life. Contrast this once more with elite life. Nobles might have more luxurious leisure, but theirs was often punctuated by anxiety, duty, and intrigue. Peasants, in contrast, focused on tangible tasks, repair, planting, tending animals, and maintaining family and community. Their drama was subtle: a stubborn goat, a frozen field, a poorly stored root crop. And yet, in that subtlety was calm. Life had patterns, small pleasures, and gentle humor, creating a rhythm that, in a quiet way, was hypnotic. Even the mental strategies of peasants remained sophisticated. Humor, ritual, observation, and continuity helped manage uncertainty. A minor mishap, like a tipped bucket of water or a lost tool, was met with sighs, eye rolls, and sometimes a dry comment rather than despair. These small gestures maintained equilibrium, created social cohesion, and quietly reinforced the rhythm of life. Survival was not dramatic, it was deliberate, repetitive, and oddly comforting. And as the sun sets on this slow spring day, the cottage once again settles into evening. Animals are fed and secured, tools are put away, food prepared, and the household gathers around the hearth. The first hints of evening coolness press against the walls, but the glow of the fire, the warmth of shared bodies, and the familiarity of daily rituals create a quiet sense of security. Stories, songs, and gentle humor fill the air, offering subtle entertainment before the slow descent into sleep. So as we linger here, imagining the thawing fields, emerging greens, and the steady rhythm of village life, we can appreciate the gentle flow of medieval seasons. Each day brought work, challenge, and subtle pleasure. Each night brought warmth, rest, and quiet reflection. Even in a world of hardship, monotony, and absurdity, life persisted with rhythm, ingenuity, and small, enduring joys. And in imagining it, we too might feel the hypnotic calm of this slow passage of time.
All right, let's settle into the warmth of summer. The snow has long since melted, the streams gurgle a little louder, and the sun lingers lazily in the sky, stretching the days into long hours of light. For medieval peasants, summer was a season of work, of repetition made slightly easier by warmth, longer daylight, and the faint possibility of small indulgences. Life, as always, had rhythm, just with a little more sweat. The day often began at dawn, or slightly before, when light first touched the cottage. Straw beds were vacated reluctantly, but necessity always prevailed. Breakfast was simple: porridge, bread, sometimes fresh eggs or milk if the cows and chickens had been cooperative. Meals were functional, yet the warmth of the sun and the promise of a long day ahead made even the simplest foods feel slightly more satisfying. Ale remained a staple, especially in the heat, though it was often diluted to stretch supplies. A lukewarm sip of ale in the morning was as much about ritual as refreshment. Summer meant long hours in the fields. Plowing, planting, weeding, and tending crops dominated daily life. Every village had its minor disasters: stubborn soil, unexpected rain, or pests nibbling at the newly sprouted plants. Each challenge was absorbed into the daily rhythm with a mixture of patience, mild frustration, and occasional dark humor. A cow wandering into a freshly planted field might elicit a quiet sigh, an eye roll, and a gentle shooing. The humor in these little disasters was understated but essential. It reminded everyone that life, no matter how demanding, had room for small amusement. Animals, as always, played a central role. Chickens pecked in the yard, pigs rooted under hedges, and goats wandered with mild independence. Every creature needed care, and the slightest mismanagement could have consequences. Summer heat required fresh water, shade, and careful feeding schedules. Livestock were simultaneously companions, tools, and sources of minor chaos. Watching them move through the day created a subtle hypnotic rhythm for villagers, broken only by the occasional clumsy mishap or squawked protest from a chicken. Festivals punctuated the long, repetitive summer. These were opportunities for communal celebration, storytelling, and gentle indulgence. Villagers might gather to honor a saint, mark a seasonal milestone, or celebrate the end of planting. Food was slightly richer: fresh bread, eggs, rare fruits, and occasionally meat if someone had been lucky with hunting or trade. Music and dancing were simple but functional: flutes, drums, improvised instruments, and clumsy steps designed to raise warmth and morale. Children ran through fields, adults hummed songs while performing chores, and minor mishaps, tripping, spilled ale, or tangled ribbons, added humor to the proceedings. Summer also emphasized the importance of observation. Peasants watched the skies, noting changes in weather, the behavior of animals, and subtle shifts in crop health. These observations guided daily work and determined the success of the season. The repetition of tasks, watering, weeding, repairing fences, was never glamorous, but it created a rhythm that was oddly soothing. Even minor setbacks, like a storm flattening part of a crop, became part of the cycle: assess, repair, adapt, continue. We should pause briefly on food once more. Summer brought freshness, but not abundance. Fresh greens, herbs, and early vegetables supplemented staples like bread, porridge, and preserved foods. Meals were shared, rhythmic and functional, but even small improvements, fresh milk, a handful of herbs, a sweet bite of fruit, were quietly celebrated. Peasants understood pleasure in moderation. It was subtle, repeated, and appreciated for its fleeting nature. Minor disasters, in fact, were woven into summer life. Sudden storms might damage crops, livestock could wander, or tools could break at inconvenient moments. Each disruption was met with calm pragmatism. There was little drama, just rhythm: observe, adapt, and continue. Humor softened the blow. A sheep stuck in a hedge might elicit a low laugh or muttered sarcasm rather than panic. Life was hard, yes, but predictable enough to allow for gentle amusement. The passage of time remained hypnotic. Days began with light, were filled with work, and ended in the soft glow of evening. Evenings were quieter than winter, as animals had more space, chores were slightly less grueling, and lingering warmth made relaxation possible. Families gathered around low fires, sharing stories, songs, and gentle humor. Rituals continued, whether simple prayers, small blessings for the harvest, or whispered warnings to children about wandering too far. These rituals provided structure and subtle comfort, reinforcing rhythm in both work and rest. And of course, humor persisted. Minor mishaps, spilled water, tangled wool, clumsy steps in dance, or misbehaving livestock were absorbed into daily life with gentle amusement. Laughter, when it appeared, was quiet, understated, a soft punctuation in the long rhythm of work and survival. Even irritation became ritualized. Sighs, muttered remarks, and rolling eyes were repeated gestures, helping to maintain equilibrium and calm. Contrast with elites once more. Nobles had summer extravagances, feasts, hunts, and elaborate rituals, yet their days were often punctuated by worry. Peasants, in contrast, had straightforward challenges, tending crops, managing animals, repairing homes, and maintaining family harmony. Their humor, subtle and dry, served a practical function. Their festivals, though simple they were, created moments of shared delight without anxiety over appearances, alliances, or scandal. Rhythm and repetition, even with minor disasters, brought calm and predictability. As the sun sets on a summer day, the cottage once again settles into evening. Animals are fed and secured, meals prepared, and the household gathers around the hearth. Minor mishaps are absorbed, a broken tool is set aside, spilled ale mopped up, and children tucked into beds. The fire glows low, shadows stretch along walls, and the rhythmic breathing of family and animals forms a gentle background hum. The day ends quietly, the cycle continues, and the subtle pattern of village life persists. Even in the seemingly mundane, there is beauty. Observation, repetition, cooperation, humor, and small pleasures combine into a gentle flow. Work, play, minor mishaps, and ritual reinforce rhythm, creating a hypnotic cadence. And in this cadence, life persists, quietly, steadily, and with a gentle, almost imperceptible joy. So, as we imagine the long summer days and warm evenings, we can appreciate the subtle mastery of medieval peasants. They endured heat, minor disasters, and long hours of work, yet maintained rhythm, humor, and small pleasures. Their lives, though not glamorous, carried a slow, hypnotic calm, offering us a lens into human persistence, endurance, and subtle joy.
Let's imagine the slow drift from the warmth of summer toward the cooler, shorter days of autumn. The sun still shines, but its light is weaker, more golden, softer, almost hesitant. The air carries the scent of ripening crops, damp earth, and the faint chill of approaching nights. For medieval peasants, autumn was a season of preparation, reflection, and quiet anxiety. The rhythm of daily life shifted. Work remained steady, but the stakes of each task were subtly higher. Harvest was the centerpiece of autumn. Fields of grain, cabbages, turnips, and other staples had to be collected, stored, and protected against both weather and pests. Every day brought long hours bending over crops, cutting stalks, gathering roots, and transporting bundles to storage. The work was repetitive and physical, but necessary. A mismanaged harvest could mean hunger in the coming winter. The rhythm of labor was hypnotic in its repetition, a steady cadence that guided the villagers through the days. Animals continued their civil roles. Chickens scratched in the yard, pigs rooted under hedges, and cows and goats were milked carefully to maintain supplies. Every movement, every task carried significance. A goat wandering into a harvested field could ruin hours of work, prompting gentle sighs and mild exasperation rather than panic. Humor persisted in these small disruptions. It was dry, understated, and helped maintain equilibrium during the long hours of labor. Autumn was also a time of preservation. Vegetables were stored in cellars, often layered in sand or straw to prolong freshness. Meats were salted, smoked, or dried to last through the winter months. Herbs were dried and bundled, ready to supplement meals or serve as remedies. Peasants moved slowly but deliberately,
following rituals developed over generations. Even in preparation, there was rhythm, continuity, and a subtle sense of control over a world that could be harsh and unpredictable. Festivals marked the calendar once more. While smaller than royal celebrations, these gatherings were meaningful. Harvest festivals, religious observances, and minor fairs brought the village together. Music, singing, and dancing punctuated the long days of labor. Children ran, adults hummed songs, and the occasional spilled drink or clumsy dance step added gentle humor. These festivals offered brief relief from the monotony of work, a subtle celebration of survival and community. Yet underlying the labor and celebration was quiet anxiety. Winter was approaching, and every task carried weight. Firewood had to be collected, homes repaired, and food stores assessed. Even minor oversights could create discomfort: a leak in the roof, a shortage of hay, or an insufficient store of grains. The awareness of winter's inevitability was constant, but largely managed through routine, observation, and repetition. Anxiety existed, yes, but it was muted by rhythm, practicality, and subtle humor. Daily meals were carefully considered. Fresh vegetables from late harvests supplemented staples like bread, porridge, and preserved foods. Ale continued as a constant companion, warming and sustaining. Minor indulgences, honey, spices, or the occasional fresh egg were quietly celebrated. Meals were functional, yes, but imbued with small pleasures, reminders that life persisted despite the challenges ahead. Let's float briefly over domestic life. Evenings were quiet and deliberate. Animals were fed and secured, tools put away, and the household gathered around the hearth. Children were tucked in, elders murmured prayers, and the fire provided both warmth and gentle illumination. Storytelling, songs, and subtle humor filled the air. Minor mishaps, spilled porridge, a clumsy child, a wandering chicken were absorbed into daily rhythms, reinforcing the hypnotic structure of life. Autumn was also a time of reflection. The successes and failures of the year were quietly acknowledged. Crops that thrived were celebrated with mild satisfaction. Losses were noted with sighs and understated frustration. Observations guided future planting, tool maintenance, and domestic planning. Even minor errors were absorbed into the rhythm of village life, becoming minor lessons rather than crises. The repetition and predictability of work provided comfort, despite the underlying pressures of survival. Contrast this subtly with elite life. Nobles managed estates, organized hunts, and oversaw feasts, but they were often anxious about alliances, appearances, and court intrigue. Peasants, in contrast, faced tangible, predictable challenges: a leaking roof, a stubborn cow, a slightly spoiled batch of grain. Their humor, repetition, and rituals created calm and resilience. Even anxiety was structured, absorbed into daily rhythms and seasonal cycles, which in its own hypnotic way was soothing. Even leisure persisted. Between chores, peasants repaired clothing, spun wool, or engaged in minor crafts. Music, storytelling, and gentle games filled slow moments. Humor, as always, punctuated the monotony: a dropped tool, a tangled rope, a minor argument over whose turn it was to fetch water. These small interruptions became part of the rhythm, subtle reminders of the humanity embedded in every task. As evening approached, the household settled into familiar patterns. The fire glowed, animals settled, and the household prepared for night. The rhythm of sleep, meals, work, and minor amusements continued. Even as winter loomed, life maintained its hypnotic cadence: observe, work, laugh quietly, prepare, rest, repeat. Each gesture, each ritual carried both practical and psychological significance. Autumn was, in its quiet way, both a preparation and a reminder. It reinforced the importance of observation, patience, humor, and community. Work, play, minor disasters, and subtle pleasures combined into a rhythm that guided peasants through the transition from abundance to scarcity, warmth to cold, light to long nights. And in imagining it, we too can feel a gentle, hypnotic calm, the kind that comes from seeing life move slowly, deliberately, and with a quiet endurance. So, as we linger on the edge of this autumn day, with golden light fading and the faint chill pressing against walls, we can appreciate the subtle mastery of village life. Work persisted, animals were tended, food stored, and communities maintained. Humor, ritual, observation, and routine ensured survival and offered quiet comfort. Life, even with its pressures and anxieties, flowed gently, rhythmically, and with a calm persistence that carried people through the inevitable winter ahead. Let's imagine the slow, inevitable return of winter. The golden hues of autumn fade, leaving a chill that grows sharper each day. Nights stretch longer, frost returns to the fields, and streams begin to freeze again, quietly, almost imperceptibly. For medieval peasants, winter is both familiar and demanding. It is a time of routine, reflection, and quiet endurance. Life slows, but the rhythm persists. Winter, in this second pass, is not dramatic. Snow does not fall in sudden avalanches, but settles gently, silently, and continuously. Paths become muted, and the landscape is softened into shades of white and gray. In cottages, fires burn steadily, animals huddle together, and families adjust once more to the familiar, hypnotic cadence of cold nights. Work is reduced, yes, but preparation continues. Food stores are monitored, livestock tended, and domestic repairs completed as needed. Every action, however small, maintains continuity in the rhythm of survival. Food once again becomes a focal point. Stored grains, preserved vegetables, salted or smoked meat, and ale sustain families. Meals are functional, simple, and repetitive, yet small details bring subtle comfort. A hint of spice, a slightly sweeter bread, or fresh milk from a cooperative cow transforms the mundane into a minor pleasure. Even routine meals provide reassurance, warmth, energy, and the quiet satisfaction of continuity. Animals, as ever, remain central. Chickens roost safely, pigs snuffle in straw pens, and cows and goats provide milk and warmth. Their care is quiet, repetitive work that binds the household together. Even minor mishaps, wandering chickens, spilled water, or a pig that escapes briefly into the snow, are absorbed with mild exasperation and gentle humor. Life is repetitive, yes, but also rhythmically comforting. Winter nights are long, and so storytelling, music, and minor rituals regain prominence. Families gather close to the fire, songs are hummed quietly, and tales of local heroes or past seasons are retold. Humor, subtle and dry, punctuates these evenings. A child's clumsy attempt at a dance, a pet wandering into the firelight, or a slightly overcooked porridge. These small, repeated gestures create a hypnotic cadence that reinforces both social bonds and psychological resilience. Reflection is a subtle theme of the season. Peasants consider the year behind them, the successes and failures of planting, harvests, minor disasters, and small joys. Observations are made, notes mentally filed for the next cycle. A field that thrived will be remembered, a pest that destroyed a crop noted, and adjustments planned. Even minor setbacks are incorporated into the rhythm. They are predictable, instructive, and gently humbling. There's a quiet satisfaction in observing continuity, in knowing that despite hardship, the rhythm persists. Festivals continue, though scaled to the season. Winter holidays, religious observances, and minor community gatherings break the monotony and provide subtle indulgence. Food may be slightly richer, ale slightly warmer, and stories a little more elaborate. Music continues, clumsy dancing persists, and children's laughter rings softly. Minor mishaps, spilled drinks, tangled ribbons, or frozen fingers are absorbed into the communal rhythm with understated humor. Even celebration, structured and modest, reinforces continuity and human resilience. Contrast once again with the elites. Kings and nobles may have lavish feasts, heated halls, and servants attending every whim, yet anxiety over politics, alliances, and appearances persists. Peasants, in contrast, faced tangible, predictable challenges, keeping warm, storing food, tending animals, and maintaining social harmony. Humor, ritual, observation, and routine sustained them quietly. Their lives, though lacking luxury, had a subtle calm, a hypnotic structure, and a continuity that carried them steadily through the season. Even minor disasters are absorbed into the rhythm. Frost-bitten roots are replaced, small repairs are made to the roof or fence, and tools are sharpened or mended. Life moves slowly but predictably. Humor remains constant, a chicken stuck in straw, a child slipping on ice, or a small domestic mishap is met with quiet amusement rather than panic. These understated responses reinforce continuity, teach resilience, and maintain calm in the face of unrelenting cold. Winter also encourages inward reflection and subtle mindfulness. With work reduced, time spent in quiet observation, watching the fire, listening to animals, noticing the drift of snow outside, becomes meaningful. Even boredom has rhythm, becoming a backdrop for meditation on survival, family, and community. Minor rituals repeated daily bring comfort and continuity, feeding animals, stirring porridge, sweeping floors, and murmuring prayers. Each action, though small, anchors life and sustains mental equilibrium. As the night deepens, cottages grow quiet, animals settle, fires burn low, and families curl together on straw beds. Children, lulled by warmth and routine, sleep deeply. Elders provide gentle murmurs, small stories, and low hums to guide the household into rest. The long night, cold and still outside, becomes a soft, rhythmic sanctuary inside. The subtle repetition of survival, humor, and minor comfort carries life steadily through the darkness. In imagining this cycle, we can appreciate the quiet mastery of medieval peasant life. Work, rest, humor, ritual, observation, and small pleasures combine into a hypnotic flow. Each season, winter, spring, summer, autumn, reinforces rhythm, ensuring survival, social cohesion, and psychological resilience. Even the monotony, hardships, and minor disasters become comforting in their predictability. So, as we linger here on the edge of winter's night, imagining the glow of firelight, the warmth of animals, the quiet rhythm of meals, chores, and rest, we can feel the hypnotic calm of life in repetition. The year moves slowly but continuously. Seasons change, cycles repeat, and human ingenuity, humor, and endurance persist quietly, without fanfare, in every cottage, field, and village across the land. Life continues gently, predictably, and with subtle beauty. And in imagining it, we can allow ourselves to drift into a calm, steady rhythm, carried along by the hypnotic cadence of survival, continuity, and the quiet joys of everyday life.
Let's stay right where we are for a moment. The fire is low, the night is long, and the village has settled into its familiar winter hush. At this point in the year, and really at any point, time for medieval peasants didn't feel like a straight line. It was a circle, a very slow, slightly muddy circle, with occasional chickens in the way. And once you lived inside that circle long enough, you stopped expecting surprises, which honestly is very soothing. The seasons returned over and over again with dependable indifference. Winter came,
Spring followed. Summer worked everyone to exhaustion. Autumn made everyone nervous again. Then winter came back, like an old acquaintance who never knocked. Peasants didn't think in decades or long-term plans. They thought in cycles. Last winter was cold. This winter is cold. Next winter will probably also be cold. And with that expectation came preparation, ritual, and a quiet mental acceptance that things were not going to suddenly improve, but they also probably wouldn't completely collapse. Probably. Superstition fit neatly into this worldview. It wasn't dramatic or frantic, it was routine. Just another layer of habit, like feeding animals or stirring porridge. Certain days were considered unlucky, so extra care was taken. Certain signs, odd animal behavior, strange dreams, unusual weather, were quietly noted and filed away. Not panicked over, just acknowledged. Because when life is unpredictable, assigning meaning to things gives the mind something to hold on to. Village superstitions were practical in a roundabout way. Hanging herbs by the door might not stop illness, but it reminded people to be cautious. Blessing crops might not change the weather, but it marked the beginning of planting season. Avoiding certain activities on certain days forced rest into otherwise exhausting schedules. Superstition, in this sense, was time management disguised as belief. And frankly, that's very efficient. There were rituals for nearly everything: lighting the first fire of winter, sowing the first seed of spring, bringing animals inside for the cold months. Even death had rituals that were quiet, repetitive, and carefully structured. These rituals were not meant to shock or impress, they were meant to soothe. They said, "This has happened before. We know what to do." And that alone was calming. Children grew up absorbing these patterns without question. They learned which days mattered, which behaviors were frowned upon, and which habits were non-negotiable. Don't whistle at night, don't waste food, don't anger the animals, don't mock the weather. The logic didn't always matter. What mattered was continuity. Following the same rules as your parents and grandparents connected you to the past, and in a world without certainty, that connection was everything. Time itself moved differently. Without clocks, days were measured by light, hunger, and fatigue. Nights were long and quiet. Winter nights especially stretched on forever, broken only by the need to tend the fire or reposition yourself for warmth. And in that extended darkness, repetition became a lullaby. The same sounds, the same smells, the same routines. Over time, the brain learned that nothing urgent was happening, that it could relax, that sleep was safe. Even gossip followed predictable rhythms. Villages were small, so news traveled slowly and repeatedly. The same story might be told dozens of times, each retelling softer, less urgent. By the 10th version, it wasn't even news anymore. It was background noise, familiar, reassuring, something to murmur about while mending clothes or stirring stew. Absurdity, too, became normalized. A cow refusing to move, a goat standing somewhere it absolutely should not be, a chicken laying an egg in a place that made no sense at all. These moments weren't dramatic interruptions, they were expected, mildly annoying, sometimes funny, always temporary. And because peasants expected small inconveniences, they rarely reacted strongly to them. Emotional energy was conserved. Panic was inefficient. Religion blended seamlessly into daily life, not as spectacle, but as routine. Prayers were short, repeated, memorized. said without flourish. Churches were cold stone buildings, but familiar ones. Services followed the same structure week after week, reinforcing the sense that life, while difficult, was ordered, predictable, contained. Even sermons, often intelligible to the average peasant, provided a steady droning presence that mirrored the rhythm of daily life. Compare this again, gently, to the elites. Nobles obsessed over lineage, reputation, scandal, and legacy. They worried about how history would remember them. Peasants worried about whether the roof would leak and whether the goat would survive the winter. One of these mindsets is significantly better for sleep. The circular nature of peasant life meant that grief, too, was absorbed into routine. Loss was acknowledged, mourned quietly, and then folded back into daily rhythm. Work continued, meals were prepared, animals needed care. The world did not stop, and in a strange way, that constancy was comforting. Life carried on regardless, and the familiar patterns provided stability even in sadness. Over years, then decades, this rhythm shaped the body and mind. Movements became automatic, responses predictable. Emotional highs and lows flattened into a steady middle ground. This wasn't despair, it was adaptation, a slow smoothing of life's sharp edges until most days felt manageable, quiet, uneventful, and uneventful in medieval life was a victory. As another winter night deepens, the cottage breathes softly. Fire pops gently. Animals shift in their sleep. Someone coughs, then settles again. Outside, snow continues to fall, indifferent and silent. Inside, nothing unexpected is happening, and that, truly, is the greatest comfort of all. The seasons will turn again. Spring will come. Summer will demand labor. Autumn will bring worry. Winter will return. And through it all, peasants will do what they have always done. Wake, work, eat, rest, repeat. With mild complaints, with quiet humor, with routines that dull fear and soften hardship. And as we sit here imagining this endless, slow-moving circle, it becomes clear why medieval life, for all its difficulties, had a strange kind of calm. When nothing is supposed to change, you stop waiting for change. You settle into the rhythm. You let the night pass. You let sleep come. And maybe, just maybe, you sleep a little deeper because of it. All right, let's keep floating along. By now, nothing much is happening, and that's exactly how medieval peasants experienced most of their lives. Time didn't announce itself. There were no birthdays with candles, no milestones neatly labeled, no sudden realization that a decade had passed. You simply woke up one day and noticed your back hurt a little more than it used to, and that was that. Aging arrived quietly. One winter, you could carry a full sack of grain without thinking about it. A few winters later, you rested halfway across the yard. No one made a speech about it. No one called it a turning point. It was just another adjustment, folded into the daily rhythm like everything else. Work shifted. Younger hands took on heavier tasks. Older hands focused on repairing, watching, advising, and occasionally shaking their heads at how things were done these days, which, to be fair, were probably identical to how they'd always been done. Generations lived close together, physically and mentally. Children grew up watching adults work, and then slowly realized they were doing the same motions themselves. Parents aged in front of them, gradually becoming slower, quieter, and more stationary. Grandparents, when present, became fixtures of the household. Not inactive exactly, just present, sitting near the fire, offering comments, telling stories that everyone had already heard but listened to anyway, because repetition was comforting. There was no clear moment when someone became old. You simply accumulated years, aches, and experience until others began deferring to you without quite explaining why. Advice was offered quietly, usually during routine tasks. No lectures, no dramatic wisdom, just small observations passed along like tools. That roof beam needs watching. The frost will come early this year. Don't trust that goat. Practical knowledge, delivered calmly, without expectation of applause. Memory itself worked differently. Without written records, family history existed mostly as stories and vague impressions. Someone's grandfather had survived a particularly bad winter. Someone's aunt had married into a neighboring village and was never quite the same afterward. Dates didn't matter. Exact details faded. What remained was mood, lesson, and repetition. This was not nostalgia, it was continuity. Children didn't rush toward adulthood. They absorbed it gradually. Responsibilities increased naturally, without ceremony. One day you were trusted with feeding animals, later with harvesting, later still with decision-making. There were no rites of passage that screamed, "Now you are grown," just an accumulation of tasks until you realized people relied on you. And reliance, more than age, defined adulthood. Old age, when reached, was not romanticized. It was accepted. Some lived long lives, many did not. But those who did weren't separated from daily life. They remained embedded in routine, contributing where they could, shelling peas, watching children, offering commentary, being there. And being there consistently mattered. Time passed without clocks or calendars controlling it. Years blurred together. People remembered events relative to each other rather than by date. That happened after the big flood. That was before the harsh winter. Life was measured in shared experience rather than numbers. And because of this, the pressure to accomplish anything by a certain age simply didn't exist. You did what needed doing, until you couldn't. Then others did it. The system absorbed you without judgment. Even death, when it came, rarely disrupted the rhythm for long. Mourning happened, yes, quietly, respectfully, but the village continued. Fields still needed tending, animals still needed feeding. Life flowed around loss rather than stopping for it. This wasn't cruelty, it was survival. And in its own way, it softened grief by placing it inside a familiar structure. Elders became living reminders of endurance. Their presence said, "This has been done before." They remembered winters worse than the current one, summers hotter, harvests thinner. Their continued existence reassured others that hardship could be survived, not dramatically, but persistently, slowly, with patience. At night, especially in winter, older villagers often slept lightly, waking early or dozing by the fire. Their world had grown smaller, but not emptier. Observation replaced action. Awareness replaced effort. It was a gradual, almost meditative transition. And so life moved forward, quietly layering generation upon generation. The same cottages, the same fields, the same paths worn deeper each year. People came and went, but the rhythm remained. The village itself became the constant. Individuals were notes in a very long, very repetitive song. As we linger here, imagining this slow passage of time, it's hard not to notice how gentle it feels. Not easy, not comfortable by modern standards, but gentle in its predictability. Nothing rushed, nothing screamed for attention. Life unfolded at a pace that allowed the mind to settle, to accept, to rest. And as another night deepens, another fire burns low, and another generation drifts into sleep, the cycle continues. Unannounced, uncelebrated, unbroken.
Let's stay right here. The fire is steady, the room is dim, and outside the weather is doing whatever it wants, as usual. For medieval peasants, weather was not small talk. It was background anxiety. woven gently into every day without ever being addressed directly. No one stood around saying, "I'm worried about the coming winter." Instead, they fixed roofs, stored extra grain, and watched the sky very carefully while insisting they weren't worried at all. Bad weather was remembered not as isolated events, but as reference points. The wet year, the year the frost came early, that summer when nothing grew. These weren't dramatic stories told with intensity. They were mentioned casually, often while doing something else, like mending or stirring a pot. The tone was flat. Because panicking years after the fact didn't help anyone. Remembering calmly, however, helped with preparation. Villagers noticed patterns, maybe not scientifically, but attentively. The way birds behaved, the way the wind shifted, the way frost lingered longer than usual. These observations weren't shared as predictions, they were shared as remarks. Feels like one of those years. Everyone understood what that meant. No one asked follow-up questions. Preparation happened quietly. Extra thatching added to roofs, tools repaired earlier than necessary, grain measured more carefully, animals watched more closely. These actions weren't labeled as emergency measures, they were just being sensible. Fear, when it appeared, was disguised as practicality, which made it easier to live with. Children absorbed this approach without instruction. They learned to watch the sky, to listen to adults talk about weather without ever naming concern, to understand that preparation was normal, not panicked. Over time, this taught emotional restraint. Anxiety existed, but it didn't dominate. It was folded into routine, like everything else. When disaster did strike, and sometimes it was handled the same way. Floods, frosts, poor harvests. These events disrupted life, but they didn't fundamentally alter the rhythm. Work shifted, diets changed, expectations lowered. Humor somehow persisted. Dry remarks about the situation were common. Complaining was allowed, but only mildly. Excessive despair was discouraged, mostly by example. Recovery was slow and uncelebrated. Fields were replanted, repairs made, losses absorbed over time. No one talked about bouncing back, they just kept going. The memory of disaster lingered, not as trauma, but as instruction. Next time, store a little more, repair earlier, pay attention sooner. Weather anxiety also reinforced community bonds. Information was shared subtly, a comment here, a warning there. No official announcements, just quiet consensus forming over time. When everyone started preparing at once, no one needed to explain why. There was comfort in this collective awareness. You weren't facing uncertainty alone. Everyone was watching the same sky, feeling the same cold, noticing the same signs. Even when nothing was said, understanding existed. That shared silence was stabilizing. At night, especially during unsettled seasons, sleep came lighter. People woke more often, listened to the wind, checked the fire, looked outside. These small interruptions weren't seen as insomnia, they were vigilance. And because vigilance was shared, it didn't feel isolating. Over generations, this relationship with weather shaped personality. Cautious, observant, patient. Not optimistic exactly, but not hopeless either. Expecting difficulty made difficulty easier to handle. And when conditions turned out better than expected, that felt like a quiet gift. Even good weather was treated cautiously. A strong harvest brought relief, but also restraint. Excess wasn't celebrated loudly. It was stored, saved, protected. Because experience had taught that abundance was temporary, and temporary things were best handled calmly. As another night settles in, the weather outside does what it always does. Wind shifts, clouds move, frost forms. Inside, life continues at the same slow pace. Someone adjusts the fire. Someone pulls a blanket closer. Someone thinks briefly about tomorrow's sky, then lets the thought go. This balance between awareness and acceptance, preparation and calm was one of the quiet strengths of peasant life. Worry existed, but it never took center stage. Routine did.
and routine, repeated endlessly, softened uncertainty into something manageable. So we sit here, imagining the steady breath of the village, listening to the wind without naming it, preparing without admitting fear, and trusting that whatever comes will be met the same way everything else has been met, slowly, together, with mild complaints, and then sleep.
Let's not rush this. There's nowhere to be, nothing urgent is happening. And for medieval peasants, this state, this long stretch of time when no crisis demanded attention, was both familiar and oddly valuable. Modern life doesn't leave much room for boredom, but medieval life was built on it. Long pauses, long waits, long afternoons where the most exciting thing was watching the light move across the floor. Boredom wasn't considered a problem. It wasn't named, analyzed, or avoided. It was simply part of the landscape, like mud or wind. When work was done, and sometimes even when it wasn't, there were stretches of time where nothing new occurred. Fields didn't grow faster because you stared at them. Bread didn't rise more quickly if you checked it again. Winter nights, especially, offered hours of stillness. During these moments, peasants waited. They waited for weather to change, for daylight, for food to cook, for seasons to turn. Waiting wasn't passive exactly. It was attentive. You noticed things while waiting. Small things, sounds, drafts. The way smoke curled differently tonight. The way an animal shifted its weight. These observations weren't exciting, but they anchored awareness in the present. Hands stayed busy even when nothing important was happening. Tools were cleaned again. Clothes mended that didn't strictly need it. Bits of wood were smoothed, straw rearranged. These tasks filled time without demanding much thought. They allowed the mind to drift without fully disengaging, a soft mental hum. Conversation during these periods was sparse, not silent, but unforced. Comments floated in and out. Observations about the cold, about how quiet things were, about how nothing much had happened lately. And no one disagreed. That was the point. Nothing happening was a kind of success. Children in particular learned patience this way. There were no constant entertainments, no distractions designed to fill every moment. They learned to sit, to watch, to listen, to invent small games out of nothing, to grow comfortable with stillness. This shaped attention spans in ways modern life rarely does. Long stretches of quiet became normal. Even adults benefited from this rhythm. Without constant stimulation, thoughts slowed, worries softened. The mind wandered, but gently. Repetition lulled anxiety into the background. When days resemble each other closely enough, the brain stops scanning for novelty. It rests. Waiting also carried a subtle social aspect. People waited together, for dawn, for meals, for weather to improve. Shared waiting created a quiet bond. You didn't need conversation to feel connected. Presence was enough. Sitting near someone, both doing nothing in particular, was a form of companionship. There were moments, of course, when boredom tipped into restlessness, when winter dragged on too long, when rain wouldn't stop, when nights felt endless. But even then, impatience was muted. Complaints were mild, delivered without urgency, because impatience didn't change anything, and everyone knew it. Time during these stretches lost its sharp edges. Hours blended together. Days passed without being counted. Memory softened. Specific details faded, leaving only impressions. Calm, cold, quiet. This blurring of time reduced pressure. If you couldn't clearly remember what day it was, it probably didn't matter. Religious observance filled some of this space, but even that was repetitive and predictable. Familiar prayers, familiar chants, the same structure week after week, not designed to excite, but to steady. Even belief in this context was a form of waiting, waiting for seasons, waiting for answers, waiting for meaning. At night, boredom and sleep blended together. Long periods of lying awake weren't unusual. People dozed, woke, dozed again. Sleep came in waves rather than blocks. This wasn't considered a disorder. It was just how nights worked. The absence of urgency made waking feel neutral rather than stressful. You simply waited for sleep to return. And eventually, it did,
In this way, medieval peasants became unintentionally skilled at something modern people struggle with, being alone with their thoughts without panicking. Not because they were enlightened, but because they had no alternative. Silence and stillness were unavoidable. Over time, the mind adapted. As another long evening stretches out, the fire burns steadily. Nothing needs immediate attention. Tools are where they should be, animals are settled, food is accounted for. The moment is empty, but not uncomfortable. Emptiness here is familiar. This kind of boredom didn't dull life. It smoothed it, reduced its spikes, allowed recovery between periods of effort. Waiting became a cushion between hardships, a space where nothing demanded reaction. So we stay here, waiting, letting time pass without marking it, letting thoughts come and go without chasing them, letting boredom soften into rest. And eventually, without effort, without announcement, rest becomes sleep.
All right, let's not rush this. Morning in a medieval village did not burst onto the scene. It crept in, slowly, reluctantly. Long before the sun appeared, people were already half awake, lying still, listening to the faint changes in the dark. The fire had cooled, the air felt different. Something about the silence had shifted. That was the signal. There were no alarms, no sudden jolts awake. You woke because your body decided it was time, or because someone else in the room shifted, or because an animal outside made a familiar sound. Sometimes you woke and stayed still for a long time, just existing in that in-between space where sleep hasn't quite let go yet. And no one considered this wasted time. It was simply part of the day beginning. Getting up was slow, very slow. Stretching happened without ceremony. Stiff joints complained quietly. Everyone accepted this. You sat for a moment, or several moments. You gathered yourself. There was no reason to hurry. The work would wait, because it always did. Light returned gradually. First a faint gray through cracks in the walls, then slightly more definition in the room. Shapes emerged, familiar ones. The bench, the door, the outline of sleeping animals. Morning did not bring novelty. It brought recognition. The first task was usually the fire, coaxing it back to life from embers saved overnight. This was done carefully, patiently. A small victory, achieved every morning. No applause, just warmth returning to the room. Food came next, but not immediately. There was no dramatic breakfast spread, usually something warm. Porridge, bread, leftovers, whatever was practical. Eating was quiet, functional, nourishment, not indulgence. Conversation, if it happened, was minimal. Everyone was still waking up mentally and physically. Children stirred slowly. They were not bounced out of bed. They drifted into the day like everyone else. Responsibilities awaited them, but not immediately. Morning allowed a grace period, a soft landing. Outside, the village came back to life gradually. One door opened, then another. Sounds emerged slowly. Footsteps, voices, animals. No single moment marked the start of the day. It assembled itself piece by piece. Work resumed without announcement. Someone went to check animals, someone else prepared tools. Tasks were picked up where they had been left the day before. Continuity mattered more than enthusiasm. No one pretended to be excited about it. Weather was noted, as always. Quiet glances at the sky, a comment or two. Nothing dramatic, just assessment. Today would be handled like any other day, adjusted slightly based on conditions. Morning was also a time for subtle coordination. Plans were formed without formal discussion. People knew what needed doing. They'd done it many times before. Routine eliminated the need for decision-making. That in itself was restful. The body warmed gradually. Muscles loosened. Movements became more fluid. Fatigue faded into the background. Not completely, but enough to function. This transition was gentle. No caffeine required. Just time and repetition. As the sun finally rose, fully and unapologetically, the day settled into its familiar rhythm. Nothing remarkable had happened.
and that was ideal. Morning in medieval life was not a fresh start in the modern sense. It was a continuation. Yesterday had ended, today picked up the thread. No reinvention required. And because mornings were so undramatic, so predictable, they didn't demand much emotional energy. You didn't need motivation, you needed presence. And presence came naturally when nothing was competing for attention. So we stay here for a moment, in the soft light of early morning, listening to the village breathe itself awake. No rush, no pressure, just the steady return of routine. The day has begun. Quietly, exactly as expected.
All right, let's not rush this. Morning in a medieval village did not burst onto the scene. It crept in, slowly, reluctantly. Long before the sun appeared, people were already half awake, lying still, listening to the faint changes in the dark. The fire had cooled, the air felt different. Something about the silence had shifted. That was the signal. There were no alarms, no sudden jolts awake. You woke because your body decided it was time, or because someone else in the room shifted, or because an animal outside made a familiar sound. Sometimes you woke and stayed still for a long time, just existing in that in-between space where sleep hasn't quite let go yet. And no one considered this wasted time. It was simply part of the day beginning.
Getting up was slow, very slow. Stretching happened without ceremony. Stiff joints complained quietly. Everyone accepted this. You sat for a moment, or several moments. You gathered yourself. There was no reason to hurry. The work would wait, because it always did. Light returned gradually. First a faint gray through cracks in the walls, then slightly more definition in the room. Shapes emerged, familiar ones. The bench, the door, the outline of sleeping animals. Morning did not bring novelty. It brought recognition. The first task was usually the fire, coaxing it back to life from embers saved overnight. This was done carefully, patiently. A small victory, achieved every morning. No applause, just warmth returning to the room. Food came next, but not immediately. There was no dramatic breakfast spread, usually something warm. Porridge, bread, leftovers, whatever was practical. Eating was quiet, functional, nourishment, not indulgence. Conversation, if it happened, was minimal. Everyone was still waking up mentally and physically. Children stirred slowly. They were not bounced out of bed. They drifted into the day like everyone else. Responsibilities awaited them, but not immediately. Morning allowed a grace period, a soft landing. Outside, the village came back to life gradually. One door opened, then another. Sounds emerged slowly. Footsteps, voices, animals. No single moment marked the start of the day. It assembled itself piece by piece. Work resumed without announcement. Someone went to check animals, someone else prepared tools. Tasks were picked up where they had been left the day before. Continuity mattered more than enthusiasm. No one pretended to be excited about it. Weather was noted, as always. Quiet glances at the sky, a comment or two. Nothing dramatic, just assessment. Today would be handled like any other day, adjusted slightly based on conditions. Morning was also a time for subtle coordination. Plans were formed without formal discussion. People knew what needed doing. They'd done it many times before. Routine eliminated the need for decision-making. That in itself was restful. The body warmed gradually. Muscles loosened. Movements became more fluid. Fatigue faded into the background. Not completely, but enough to function. This transition was gentle. No caffeine required. Just time and repetition. As the sun finally rose, fully and unapologetically, the day settled into its familiar rhythm. Nothing remarkable had happened, and that was ideal. Morning in medieval life was not a fresh start in the modern sense. It was a continuation. Yesterday had ended, today picked up the thread. No reinvention required. And because mornings were so undramatic, so predictable,
They didn't demand much emotional energy. You didn't need motivation. You needed presence. And presence came naturally when nothing was competing for attention. So we stay here for a moment in the soft light of early morning, listening to the village breathe itself awake. No rush, no pressure, just the steady return of routine. The day has begun. Quietly, exactly as expected.